All right. All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Liron Gertsman. I'm so excited to be here today to share my passion with you for my love of photography and wildlife. And you'll notice I definitely love birds and this part of the world that we call home. Western Canada is an amazing place. I really love to try to capture photos of the natural world that show it off in a unique way. Just capture photos that aren't the obvious photos, photos that tell a bit of a story. Hence why I call this wildlife in a unique light. I got my start in this path at a very young age. I think my earliest photos that I still have to this day were captured when I was about like 4 or 5 years old with a little camera that my parents had that they would use to take pictures of the family. But when we would go out to the local parks in Vancouver, places like Stanley Park, I would always try to borrow the camera to take pictures of things like ducks and geese and crows and the wildlife that you encounter in the city. But the passion just kept growing. I got more and more into it. I really fell in love with bird watching and looking for wildlife and learning about wildlife. I ended up studying biology at the University of British Columbia, but as was mentioned, I now work full time as a wildlife photographer and as a guide and workshop leader and tour leader in Western Canada and around the world. So I largely credit this deep passion that I have for the place that I was very lucky to grow up in and still live today, the coast of British Columbia. As we're all aware, this is a remarkable place. I'm constantly reminded of that because people come here from all around the world. Whenever I'm running tours, there's people from Germany and Australia, and of course, local people as well. There's always locals too. But this is a place that people travel to from all around the world to experience. Um, when I think when people think of this region, they think of things like humpback whales. This was a beautiful sunset, and one whale breached, made a big splash, and then a second whale breached in front of the splash of the first breach, which is what you see in this photo here. And then the next day, this was actually on an eagle photography trip out of Vancouver Island, where we also happened to see lots of other wildlife. We just got this beautiful, like late afternoon sun backlighting these whales that were just resting. They weren't even breaching, they weren't that active, but just the perfect lighting on an otherwise simple scene can sometimes make for a really spectacular image and a really special experience. You wouldn't think that seeing a whale breathe would be just as spectacular as seeing a whale breach. But in this case, I think everyone there would agree that it was something about just, sitting with the engines completely off in the boat, just sitting there watching the whales come and go in through the entrance of this cove and be their breast backlit and just hearing that sound carry across the inlet was pretty special. As much as I do love photographing, the big charismatic megafauna, things like humpback whales, I'm also really a fan of capturing the underappreciated species, the things that are talked about a little bit less, and trying to come up with new and creative ways to photograph them. This photo here is an example of that. This is a photo that is half above water, half underwater. And underwater, you see there some aggregating sea anemones. They are such an alien-like creature. They reproduce by like sputting. They split themselves in two, basically cloning themselves. They're so alien. And I was like, what would be a really cool backdrop for that, for, the tide pool life that we have here on the coast of British Columbia? I was like, well, how about the night sky? So what you see here is the above water section. You can see the night sky. That's the moon on the horizon. It's not the sun, of course, because if the sun was out, you wouldn't see the stars. And underwater, there are the sea anemones, and I'm shining a light on them to light them up. And this is with a camera that's suspended like half above the water, half underneath the water. So we've got some really remarkable coastal environments here. But to be honest, what really got me started in this path, it was not the whales and the tide pools. It actually began with birds. And it just so happens that here on the coast of British Columbia, we're located along the Pacific Flyway, which is basically a bird migration superhighway. Every year, there are millions and millions, possibly even billions of birds that are traveling north up the Pacific Flyway in the springtime and south down the Pacific Flyway in the fall. So right now, as we speak, we are coming right into the core of the spring migration. I would say like the first week of May around here is often when there's the most going on, the most new birds arriving for the spring migration. And among those migrating birds are large flocks of sandpipers. It's believed that the majority of all western sandpipers in the world stop over on the Fraser River Delta, specifically around Roberts Bank. There's also lots of dunlin, which are pictured here, that migrate through, and also some of them winter in this area as well. So getting to witness the bird migration spectacles here is pretty incredible. I love photographing it at, like sunrise and sunset when you get the beautiful colors like you see here. And this photo was with a slow shutter speed technique, which allows me to capture like the motion in the wings of the birds and kind of capture a little bit of that chaos and that movement. Here's another example of the slow shutter speed technique being used to capture movement. This is a photo I captured a long time ago. This is probably the oldest photo in this presentation. It's probably like maybe 12 or 13 when I took this one. And this is a big flock of snow geese, another one of the migratory species that passes through this area. And a bald eagle flew over this flock in the marsh, and they all erupted into the air at once. We sometimes call that a blast off, and I specifically used the slow shutter speed in order to capture the movement, and was happy with how the photo came out. Here's another shot of the snow geese, another one of these species that I really think of when I think of the migration around here. For this photo, I actually put a camera out in a field and I triggered it with a remote control to get kind of this wide angle up close perspective as all these geese came in for a landing. Because if I was standing there or lying there with my camera, the geese wouldn't be landing right above me like this. So I had to kind of put the camera there and trigger it remotely so that the geese would be comfortable landing, which was only possible if I wasn't right there. And of course, it's not just the water birds that we have. This time of year where all the rufous hummingbirds have recently returned, and there's so many more of the little birds and songbirds that are arriving right now. These birds are so incredible. The rufous hummingbird, they spend the winter in Mexico. They migrate all the way up to British Columbia, some of them all the way up into Alaska, and they time their arrival with when a lot of the native flowers, like these red flowering currants, blossom. This was really unique lighting. This was when I was studying at UBC, and there were a lot of red flowering currants on campus that would have a lot of hummingbirds in April, this time of year. Actually, I should probably go just check it out this week. And these flowers were being lit by streetlights as it would get dark, just by the lights that light up the sidewalks and the streets at UBC. And right as it got dark was also when there would often be the most hummingbird feeding activity, because they'd all be feeding before nightfall. And I just kind of set up my camera on some flowers that were being really nicely lit by some of these street lights, kind of like shining right on the flowers. And I didn't have to wait long before this rufous hummingbird came right into where I had pointed my camera. So we've got some amazing bird migration here. We also happen to have the biggest bald eagle gatherings anywhere in the world here in southwestern British Columbia. And at different times of years, there are different gatherings of bald eagles that take place. One of my favorite gatherings to photograph takes place in the Discovery Islands, kind of between central Vancouver Island and the mainland, in the late spring, early summer, when really strong tidal currents push hake, which is a small fish in the cod family, up to the surface of the water. And there are hundreds of eagles that gather to fish for these hake that get pushed up to the surface by the tidal currents. Eagles often are quite opportunistic. They scavenge a lot on like carcasses. So an opportunity to get to watch them be so active, swooping down, grabbing fish off the surface like this, they actually don't come very often. And this has become the focus of a photography tour and workshop that I lead every summer out of Campbell River, going to photograph these bald eagles. My favorite time is, again, like, around sunset when you get the beautiful golden light. Such an incredible thing to experience, and really a photographer's dream. A great way to hone in on the action photography skills as well, because those eagles fly fast. But the good news is there's hundreds of them, so you get lots of opportunities to get the shot. I like capturing intimate action shots, close up, images like this, but I also like taking a moment to zoom out, take a step back, and capture environmental scenes as well. Because these sorts of environmental photos tend to be more unique because they are specific to the time and place where you took those photos. That this moment with these clouds and this eagle flying there, this will never be repeated ever again in this exact way. So by photographing animals within the context of their environment, where maybe they're a little bit smaller in frame, it really unlocks a new storytelling potential with photography, in my opinion. And as I'm sure everyone here is aware, spending time on the water on the coast here, we have such a beautiful coastline. So I feel like it would be silly not to try to incorporate some of that beautiful landscape in the photos as well. Now, the biggest bald eagle gatherings and some of the most spectacular wildlife gatherings in general here on the coast, of course, take place during the salmon run, beginning in the late summer and continuing into the fall and even into the early winter in some areas. It's an incredible thing to experience from a very young age. It's been kind of my favorite time of year. I would say is like September, October, that fall season when the rivers are filling up with salmon. And just like with the birds and with the wildlife, I'm always looking for ways to capture different perspectives on familiar subjects. And for this photo here, I spent my whole life looking down at salmon in the river, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool to be underneath them and look up at them? So what I did is I don't scuba dive, but I do enjoy snorkeling and free diving. So I swam my camera down to the bottom of the river in an underwater waterproof housing, and I kind of anchored it in place with some weights at the bottom of the river. And then I set it on what's called an interval timer, which allows me to basically have the camera just continuously take photos. So I set it to take like one photo every second. And I left the camera there for maybe like 45 minutes or so at the bottom of the river. And then I swam back down to retrieve it. And I got lots of photos like this of the salmon swimming above the camera, looking up towards the sky. Just kind of a different perspective from how we normally see them. The biggest gatherings of bald eagles take place during the salmon run. I believe the world record count comes from the Fraser Valley from the Harrison River of close to 10,000 eagles in a single day. So huge numbers of bald eagles gather for the salmon run. But it's not just eagles. During my explorations of the BC coast, I've been fortunate to spend a lot of time with all sorts of other animals that rely on the salmon spawn every single year. This is one of the most elusive ones that you don't encounter very often, but this is a coastal wolf. And I have actually seen a couple times now, especially in the Great Bear Rainforest, which is another area where I guide trips, wolves catching salmon in the estuaries in the fall. I've yet to get a good photo of a wolf with a salmon. It's always been a little far away. And, with animals like wolves, you want to be very respectful and not, get too close to them, kind of let them dictate their comfort levels with your presence. But this remains kind of my favorite, I think, moment with a wolf that I've ever had. Just the beauty of the scene, the calm water reflecting the grass and the foliage in this fallen tree was just so beautiful in this estuary. In the Great Bear Rainforest, we do spend a lot of time looking for and observing bears that gather around the streams to fish for salmon. For the grizzly bears, we're usually just kind of floating down the river in zodiacs, and bears come to the edge of the river to fish. I call this one bear hug. Kind of looks like the grizzly bear is giving the salmon a big hug. It's definitely not doing that. It's definitely just getting the salmon into position to eat it. But it's a pretty remarkable thing to get to witness this. And I'm very fortunate as a guide to get to visit these places every year. And one of the cool things about that is that you don't only get to know the area in general, you also get to know the individual bears. And these two siblings are, I think, my favorite bears I've ever met. I doubt they know that I really exist or care about me, but I certainly care about them. Um, they're just so much fun to watch. I met them first when they were little first year cubs with their mom, and I watched them grow up all the way until they're now actually independent young adults on their own. But these photos were taken when they were 3 years old. It was their first year on their own away from their mom, but the two of them still stuck together and were getting up to all sorts of shenanigans, constantly play fighting with each other and tearing bark off of trees and rolling around in the mud. They were just such a joy to watch. And bears just have so much personality. This is what I was referring to with pulling bark off of trees. They were really interactive with their natural surroundings. The Great Bear Rainforest is such a beautiful place, though, this kind of central north coast of the province. So when I'm photographing the bears there, I'm always looking to, again, incorporate that beautiful environment whenever possible. Here's another shot of those two siblings. They climbed up to a really mossy riverbank to rest after a busy morning of play fighting with each other and catching salmon. And this is them when they were a bit younger, still hanging out with their mom. This photo to me really captures the feeling of the Great Bear Rainforest. Just really classic kind of misty clouds. And then, of course, the estuaries with the bears that are gathering to eat the salmon. So in these larger mainland estuaries, that's where we tend to see a lot of the grizzly bears. But Black bears are observed a lot more often in general on the coast of British Columbia. They're a lot more common on the islands, all down the coast. They're of course on the mainland as well, but a lot of them are have their highest concentrations on islands. In fact, I think Vancouver Island might have the highest density of black bears in the world. Um, but again, I love using kind of different photography techniques to photograph them. This was that slow shutter speed technique. And when I showed it to you earlier, I was using it to capture the motion in the wings of the birds. But in these photos here, I'm using it to capture the motion in the water as these bears are fishing for salmon in the rivers. The bears can be quite picky eaters. When food is good, they will very much favor specific parts of the salmon. They love like the roe of the from the female salmon, and they'll just step on the fish, squish out the roe, and eat the roe. They'll also like just the other fatty parts of the salmon. Like sometimes they eat the brains and the head of the fish. So they've got their favorite parts of the fish. Up on the north coast in the Great Bear Rainforest, it is of course home to one of the perhaps rarest bear types in the world, the spirit bear. Spirit bears are black bears, but they are black bears with a rare recessive mutation that turns their fur white. And the latest estimates put their population at somewhere in the range of like 50 to 150 individuals. So there are not a lot of spirit bears out there. So it's never something that's guaranteed to be seen on a trip to the Great Bear Rainforest, but with time and effort, it certainly increases your chances. And I have been fortunate to have many encounters over the years, probably on about 60% of the trips that I've made up there. This is a well-known female bear named Warrior. She's very recognizable because of that scar across her nose. This is a beautiful afternoon. This is backlight kind of lighting the bear from behind. It outlines its fur with the shadowy forest behind, so it really helped her stand out. And this is Warrior's sister, who's been named Strawberry. And this was a couple years ago when Strawberry had a cub with her, who affectionately got nicknamed Blackberry. So it's because of how few bears there are, spirit bears there are, most of the individuals that are regularly seen by humans have kind of been named and are well monitored by the local First Nations. Like these bears are in the Gitgat territory. And Marvin is the Gitgat guide there who knows the bears better than anyone. So the fish are a really important food source for these bears. Actually, in years that they have more salmon and they eat well, they produce more cubs the following year because although bears mate in the spring, they don't actually have the fertilized egg implant and develop until late in the fall. And that how many of those fertilized eggs that will ultimately grow depends on the health of the bear. So if they've eaten really well, they have more cubs. But the role of the salmon goes beyond just feeding the bears. This is a really big interconnected ecosystem. The bears, they have favorite parts of the fish, so oftentimes they leave behind a lot of scraps. And the scavengers will come in, and animals like this crow come and they kind of clean up the leftovers left behind by the bears. Bald eagles also come to eat the salmon. They're equipped with talons and beaks, and oftentimes they carry the fish up into the trees to eat them where they're less likely to get challenged by other eagles. Bears do something very similar. Oftentimes bears, especially the smaller ones, when they catch fish, will run off into the forest to eat them. And where I'm going with this is that all these animals are catching these salmon, bringing them into the forest or pooping throughout the forest, and they're fertilizing the forest as they do this. It's not that unusual when you go for a walk near a salmon stream to find bits of salmon in the forest, kind of decomposing in the forest floor. And we now know from all of our scientific research that this very much fertilizes the growth of the forest and gives way to some of the fastest and largest growing trees in the world. Where you have salmon nutrients present in the forest, it really bolsters the growth of the forest itself. So these animals aren't just eating the fish, they're quite literally taking care of their habitat that they call home by eating the fish. It's a remarkable interconnected ecosystem. And I wanted to capture a photo that really told this story as best as possible. And after about a week of effort, this is what I came up with. So this is another photo that's half above water, half underwater. And above the water, you can see a black bear walking by. Underwater, you can see a pink salmon female swimming by. And of course, the forest is behind. To get this photo here, I was not holding the camera in hand. This bear is actually extremely close to the camera because this is an ultra wide angle lens. So rather than holding the camera in my lens, which probably would have had a lot more disturbance to the river, to the fish, and to the bears, I actually put it in the river. and used the interval trick again. So I set it to just take one photo every second. This did require a lot of like planning and scouting to figure out where would be the best spot to put it. And then I just came in every like 3 or 4 hours when the batteries died or when I needed a memory card to be swapped out, and I would swap it out and then leave the camera there again. And after about a week of working on this, this was the favorite photo that resulted. So we've looked here at the coast of British Columbia, but it's not just the coastline that makes this part of the world so special. We also have amazing access to the mountains. And the mountains are another place where I spend a lot of my time photographing birds and wildlife and landscapes. It's home to some really unique species. This here is a ptarmigan, basically a chicken that lives up in the high alpine. They camouflage so well because they actually change their feathers throughout the year to match their surroundings. So they're white in the winter for the snow, and they're kind of brown and gray in the summer for the rocks. But the mountains here are home to some really cool animals. My favorite terrestrial mammal is the mountain goat. I just think they're so cool. They're so unique. Like you wouldn't think of goats as being something that lives in the mountains. Like obviously we have the mountain goat, but they're just such a unique animal in this environment. So well adapted to their surroundings. They live in really challenging terrain. They cross the steep cliffs and the slippery ice fields. And I just have great memories and experiences of observing mountain goats. But again, I don't just love, the famous animals. I also really enjoy spending time going after the lesser known species. This here is a spruce grouse. There's a short window every spring that I affectionately refer to as hormonal chicken season. It's the time of year when the grouse are all super hormonal looking for mates. And they go from being really kind of hard to photograph to, if you can find one, they're still hard to find, but if you can find one, they're just so hormonal that like I've been courted by many grouse over the years. And this was one of them. I was kind of just lying down in the forest floor waiting for him to do his thing, and he saw me and he's coming up to me and he's like flicking his tail around and doing his dance. Perhaps he was trying to intimidate me, I'm not sure, but it was quite a fun thing to witness. And every year, kind of in the April-May season is when these grouse are doing their spring courtship displays. There is one region in the mountains in Western Canada that is probably my favorite to spend time. It's been nicknamed the Haines Triangle. It's kind of this, if you look at the map, there's like a triangular section of northwestern British Columbia that's surrounded by the Yukon and Alaska. That's called the Haines Triangle. It's home to some really remarkable birds and some absolutely incredible scenery. This here is the Arctic tern. I have two favorite birds. The Arctic tern is one of them. You'll see the other favorite bird later, but the Arctic tern holds a special place for me because they hold the record for the longest migration of any bird or organism, never mind just bird, any living thing on the planet that does a regular migration. The Arctic tern nests, as their name would suggest, as far north as the high Arctic. And then they migrate all the way to Antarctica for the non-breeding season, and then all the way back to the Arctic the following year to the same nesting grounds they used the year before. They can live several decades. They can migrate close to 100,000 kilometers in a single year, which is close to 3 laps around the circumference of the Earth. And in their lifetime, that's roughly equivalent to doing 3 trips to the moon and back, and then going to the moon one more time. So the average Arctic tern has covered a whole lot more distance than any astronaut ever will in traveling to the moon, unless people start going to the moon, 4 times in their career. But they are pretty remarkable birds. There's all sorts of other cool species to be found up there, though. Lots of migratory shorebirds. This is the wandering tattler. It winters in tropical Pacific islands as far south as Australia, and then they migrate up to northern Canada to nest. Trumpeter swans are common in the wetlands. Sometimes you see short-eared owls nesting in the wetlands too. It's a pretty cool place, a really neat assortment of birds. There's also other wildlife there too. The mountains in northern British Columbia are home to lots of grizzly bears. This is a really kind of atmospheric, light, rainy afternoon. And this here is a big male bear pursuing a female bear. It's kind of what courtship looks like for these bears. It's just kind of a male kind of following behind a female for like a week until she decides whether she wants to be his mate or whether she's done with him. But good size comparison here between the two. This was a pretty cute moment I captured of this mother bear leading her 3 yearling cubs across the road. Very remote road. I'm sure they occasionally encounter vehicles, but probably when they cross this road, they don't normally see a car. And if I have a science background, we're maybe not supposed to put emotions into animals, but I can tell you as a photographer that you do definitely see emotion in animals all the time. At least that's my opinion, especially in animals like bears. Once again, though, I'm not just about the bears. I love the unsung heroes. This is a porcupine, another fairly common animal up in the mountains of northern British Columbia. I have had some encounters with very elusive species up there over the years too. This is a Canada lynx. I've seen a few of them over the years. I've probably had a lot more see me than I've seen, but it is cool to be in the presence of an animal like this. I've also seen wolverine up there once, so there are some really rare and elusive animals that can be seen. You just need a lot of time in the field, and eventually you get lucky and you cross paths with something like a lynx or a wolverine. Earlier, I showed you photos of a ptarmigan. The Haines Triangle is a particularly unique place because there's three species of ptarmigan in the world, and all three of them are found in the Haines Triangle. There's not a lot of places like that. The most common is this one, the willow ptarmigan. This is another photo from the hormonal chicken season. He was singing to me, I guess. They have a very funny sounding call. If you ever get a chance, you should look up the courtship call of a willow ptarmigan. They're the most common ptarmigan. The next most common ptarmigan up there is the rock ptarmigan. They're just so funky looking. This is the spring courtship plumage. They've got these bright kind of patches of skin that they flare up, probably full of blood, and use that in their courtship during the spring. And this is the white-tailed ptarmigan. If you look closely, there's actually two of them here. That's the male above, and he's courting a female who's just tucked in on the slope just below him there. Really well camouflaged. Ptarmigan are notoriously hard birds to see because they do camouflage really well. You've seen some photos of them kind of in the spring. This is what they look like in the winter. They completely turn white and they completely disappear into the snow. The one thing that does make them a little easier to find in the winter, though, is that as long as there's not a lot of fresh snow or wind, they do leave behind a lot of tracks. So where you see clusters of tracks, you can often kind of look around where you're seeing all these tracks, and you very often will find a ptarmigan or sometimes a whole flock of ptarmigan. These mountains, the St. Elias Mountains in northwestern British Columbia and southwestern Yukon, are beautiful at any time of year, but I actually think they get their most beautiful in the winter. When everything is covered in snow, it just smooths out the landscape. It looks like another planet, to be honest. And I love photographing it during the daytime, but it is equally spectacular, if not more spectacular, to be out there at night. You're so far away from the city lights that the stars are just so beautiful. There's no light pollution whatsoever. And it is far enough north that I would say more nights than not, there is some presence of northern lights that comes out for some period of the night. And I have been treated to some magnificent displays. This is a region where I guide tours both in the summer season and in the winter season. And I actually just got back from another trip up there this winter and got to see the brightest and most fastest moving northern lights display I've ever seen. There's wildlife up there too. Animals like foxes are not uncommon at all. This was on a really windy day. You can see how the wind is parting the fur of the fox and the fox is squinting into the wind. But like I was saying earlier, in addition to getting these sort of close-up photos, I also like, getting the more environmental photos that showcase the environment. The foxes, and honestly all of the predatory species that live in these snowy climates, they're super powered. They can hear rodents that are like buried deep under the snow. They can hear them moving around. They can hear their heart beating, and the foxes will pounce up in the air and go headfirst into the snow to try to capture them. And the foxes are easier to find in the winter than the summer because in the summer they just are disappearing in all the foliage. In the winter, they really stand out in the snow. This is a photo from actually just when I was there a couple weeks ago. Small in frame on the left there, you can see the fox walking across the snowy environment with those beautiful mountains in the background. I love photographing in places that are beautiful because it becomes honestly way easier to get good photos when if the scene is already beautiful, just as it is, without any animal or rare wildlife or anything in the frame, and then you can find an animal and get the animal with that scenery around them, it just leads to really neat photos where you really feel the place where the animals live. This is another one of the animals that survives year round up in the St. Elias Mountains. This is a Dall's sheep. And you find them in the windiest places because they survive on plants. So if by living in the windiest places, the wind blows the snow away and then they can access the grasses all through the winter. The Rockies are also a gorgeous place to photograph wildlife. Here's a pair of common ravens in Banff. Um, and just again, when you are in a beautiful place and you have an opportunity to photograph anything, it just makes it a lot easier to get a beautiful photo. And I love combining kind of the landscape photography with the wildlife photography. I do spend time in Alberta every winter guiding and looking for one of my favorite family of birds, which are owls. And the winter season in Western Canada, especially out in Alberta, is a really fantastic time of year for owls. This here is a northern pygmy owl. It's the smallest owl species that we have in Canada. They're probably about the size of my fist. They're really tiny. Um, in the wintertime, there's a lot less foliage in the trees, so it becomes a whole lot easier to find owls. They have less places to hide. It is also actually, like, especially late winter, like February, when I do these tours, is the start of the breeding season for the owls, so they also are quite active, calling, looking for mates. And a lot of owls nest actually quite far north in Canada, like this snowy owl, and they migrate down to places like central and southern Alberta in the winter. So there are just a whole lot more owls around. Um, I saw in my explorations out there this winter 9 species of owl. So there's a whole lot of different owl species out there. A favorite for many people on these trips that I do is often the great gray owl. They're a big owl. They're often known as the ghost of the boreal forest. They're quite active at sunrise and sunset, which is absolutely glorious for photography. And that makes them really special to watch because they're not like other owls, which you just find sleeping during the day. As long as you are respectfully observing them, you have the chance to see all sorts of cool natural behaviors, and they are quite actively hunting during the day. But my personal favorite owl is the northern hawk owl. This owl species is completely diurnal, so they are out and about during the day hunting, and they're just so unique looking. In many ways, the way they fly, the way they hunt, they resemble a hawk, but they are indeed an owl. They're an owl species that not nearly as many people have heard of, though, and I can see why. Like they're not abundantly common, but often when you find a hawk owl, they will hang on to the same territory all winter, so you can often keep seeing the same individual kind of over and over again. This was a photo that was a long time coming. I'd long wanted to photograph a owl in front of the moon because why not? People think of owls, they think of nighttime, they think of the moon. And I finally got a good chance. This was last winter. There was a hawk owl that was quite reliable, and I knew there was a full moon rise coming up, and I knew that where the hawk owl often sat on the tops of its favorite trees, if I got to the right spot, the moon would be rising right behind them. And with that planning, I went there, and sure enough, the moon was rising. The hawk owl landed on the tip of this tree, and I was able to line up this shot here. So I love, planning sort of ambitious photos like this and doing what I can to make them happen. So I've shown you a lot of my wildlife photography from Western Canada, from cold places and rainy places. But I also do enjoy on occasion getting to visit some more tropical climates. So I thought I would share with you also some warm weather photos. Although it's not always warm in places like Ecuador when you're up high in the mountains. But Ecuador is a country where I have spent a lot of time. I'm actually heading there again on Friday for another tour. This is the sword-billed hummingbird, the only bird in the world that has a beak as long or longer than the length of its body. This is my favorite hummingbird. Ecuador is home to a huge diversity of birds. During these trips that I do, we usually spend time in the Andes and we spend time in the Amazon, and across that slope you just see a massive array of birds and wildlife. This is a rufous-bellied seed snipe with Cotopaxi volcano in the background. But probably the most exciting birds in the Andes is just the huge diversity of hummingbirds. There's almost as many species of hummingbird in Ecuador as there are birds in like the Vancouver region total. In a week or two in Ecuador, it's very easy to see over 50 species of hummingbirds. The previous photo was a tourmaline sun angel. This here is a velvet purple coronet, just a close-up of their feathers. This here is a sparkling violet ear There's such a diversity of hummingbird species, and they all have awesome names like sparkling violet and velvet purple coronet. So the Andes are a really special place. During these trips, we also spend time in the Amazon, which is home to some really unique birds like these hoatzins. There's no bird closely related to the hoatzin. It's just the hoatzin. So when people ask me what type of bird is a hoatzin, all I can say is, well, a hoatzin is a hoatzin. There's nothing closely related to the hoatzin. My favorite phenomenon, though, in the Amazon are what are called clay lakes. Clay lakes are these places where there has been some erosion exposing clay, often at the edge of a river, or sometimes, rainfall exposes, like erodes the soil somewhere in the rainforest. And there's a whole lot of animals, especially parrots and parakeets and macaws, that eat a lot of very acidic and toxic fruits in their diet. And coming to eat the clay at these clay lakes is kind of like the equivalent for a human would be getting a stomachache and taking a Pepto-Bismol. That's kind of like what they're doing. They're eating the salts and minerals in the clay in order to counteract the effects of really kind of toxic minerals in some of the fruits that they eat. These here are some scarlet macaws and orange-cheeked parrots. Again, here using that slow shutter speed technique to capture the motion. And this is a beautiful clay lake kind of in the rainforest, maybe like a couple kilometers from the side of the river. These are cobalt-winged parakeets, and for these parakeets, they've got these beautiful, bright cobalt blue wings. So I purposely used a slow shutter speed to capture the blur and color of those wings when they all took to the air after they were finished eating the clay and drinking the mineral-rich water at this clay lake. So that's a look at Ecuador. One other place where I'm guiding tours in tropical environments is in Mexico. Mexico is also home to some really incredible bird life. And one really neat thing in these tropical environments where tourists have a role to play is that a lot of the protected areas are privately owned. They're privately owned reserves. In some countries, there's limited, I guess, you could argue the same in Canada, but there's limited, I guess, government protection of places and species, especially when it comes to enforcement, which again, you can kind of say for most countries in the world. But that means that a lot of the best protection for species, endangered species like this military macaw, that takes place is in private reserves that are funded by tourists coming to visit these reserves and getting to see these rare animals in their natural habitat in the wild. The military macaw, for example, is quite threatened by poaching for the pet trade, as well as habitat loss, like logging of old growth pine forests. But there are places that are protected, macaw sanctuaries, where they have nesting boxes and protected habitats that the macaws make very good use of, and also provides an amazing place to get to watch them do their thing in their natural habitat. The highlight for me, though, of visiting Mexico is spending time on offshore islands off the West Coast. And I'm really excited to be going to these islands on a tour in January, for the first time bringing a group of people with me. But these islands are kind of like the Galapagos of Mexico, but with way less tourism, which means you can spend a whole lot more time there. And it's home to just huge numbers of nesting seabirds like these blue-footed boobies. I love capturing behaviors of birds, the interactions between the species, the moments of character, like when the blue-footed boobies come in for a landing with their feet up in the air. They're just such amazing birds to watch do their courtship. There's actually several species of booby on the island. These are cocos boobies. They come in a couple different colors, a light one and a dark one, which you see here. This is what their babies look like. And the amazing thing in these places is the birds don't have predators, so they have no fear of humans because they don't know to fear humans. There's no terrestrial, naturally occurring predators. The only predators they might really have are the occasional like raptor from the sky. So it really provides an unparalleled way to observe them in their natural environment. This here is a magnificent frigatebird tackling a cocos booby. The frigatebirds are kleptoparasites, so they steal their food from other seabirds instead of catching it on their own. And the magnificent frigatebirds are the most abundant bird on these islands. And again, the opportunity to be with them so up close where they don't have fear of people really just allows for getting really creative with the photography and really getting an amazing understanding of their courtship and their life cycle. They're amazing birds. So the Arctic tern was my first favorite bird. The magnificent frigate bird is usually what I say as my other favorite bird. I like them equally. Can't pick between my favorites. But the reason I like the magnificent frigate birds is just because they're so unique looking. They have the most incredible silhouette. It's pterodactyl-esque. And they're huge. And it's really just the experiences, though, that lead to these birds being my favorite. Getting to spend time with them and witness them up close, doing their thing in such big numbers, and really learning to photograph them carefully and lining up photos like this. This is a completely real photo. It's not a composite. By going behind where all the frigate birds fly as the moon is rising at dusk, I can line up photos like this. Over the years, as I photograph birds, in my pursuit to kind of try to get more and more unique bird photos, I've really started enjoying photographing birds not just during the daytime, but also at night. Aside from bird photography, I also really love astronomy and astrophotography. I got into that thanks to a really passionate science teacher in high school, Mr. Prosick, and an astronomy unit that he did. So I've really enjoyed this challenge of photographing birds at night with things like the stars. This is on those islands off the west coast of Mexico because of how little tourism there is there. You can camp out on the islands overnight, and that's allowed me to get photos like this of the frigate birds under the Milky Way. It started though with photographing birds at night without getting like the starry night sky. Here in Vancouver, for example, we've got roosting crows, and it's a fun challenge to photograph them in the low light. This was on a really rainy day. Occasionally wandering into downtown Vancouver, there are barred owls that venture in to hunt the rats, which is an amazing thing. It's incredible the type of wildlife that exists even in the middle of the city. Slowly, though, these efforts have become more ambitious and more exotic. These are Hawaiian geese, or nene, walking around the rim of the erupting Kilauea volcano. So that is lava being hurled into the air in the background. And the volcano has actually created the habitat where the geese live. The volcano is responsible for like the open environment around the summit where all these geese come to nest. So these geese don't just happen to live at a volcano. They live there because of the volcano, which is pretty remarkable. Then I started photographing birds under the stars. This is a great horned owl under the starry night sky. This here is a great blue heron under the northern lights. This was in Stanley Park on May 10th, 2024. We had the biggest northern lights storm of probably the last 25 years or so. And I went out that night with the goal of photographing birds underneath the northern lights. Along this journey, though, I've also really gotten into eclipses and photographing birds with eclipses, which sounds kind of crazy, but with some careful planning, it is possible. This is a crow roosting in Burnaby in front of a lunar eclipse, what's known as a blood moon, which is when the shadow of the Earth gets cast onto the moon, because from the perspective of the moon, the sun is going behind the Earth. So it's kind of like a sunset on Earth being projected onto the moon. And I thought, well, what would be a better kind of complementary subject for a blood moon than some crows? I feel like they kind of fit that moody theme, and it was also a subject that I was familiar with. And this is really key for photos like this, is being familiar with the birds and being able to plan and practice and really be ready to get everything right when the moment comes. There's another type of eclipse, though, which is a solar eclipse, which is when the moon passes in front of the sun from our perspective here on Earth. There's solar eclipses can sometimes be partial, like this, where the sun is still very much bright and the moon is only partially covering it. Here is another partial solar eclipse at sunrise. This is an American black duck. This was actually in Quebec on the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But over the years, I kind of developed this dream photo, which was a bird in front of a total solar eclipse. For those unfamiliar, total solar eclipses occur when the moon completely blocks out the sun. It turns daytime briefly into nighttime for a span of just a few minutes. And these eclipses can only be seen along very narrow corridors known as paths of totality. Any given spot on the Earth will only experience a total solar eclipse on average every several hundred years, like 300 to 500 years. So you're basically never going to see a total solar eclipse unless you go to travel and see one, unless you're extremely lucky to live somewhere where one is taking place. But after almost 2 years of planning, like 1.5 years of hardcore planning, I made this trip to the west coast of Mexico, where I already had some knowledge of the birds and the behaviors. And I used a boat, a small boat, to position myself next to some islets where lots of my favorite bird, the magnificent frigate birds, were nesting. And my theory was that at nighttime, when it's time to roost, these islands always have hundreds of birds pouring into them, coming into roost. So I figured when the total solar eclipse happens, the birds will think it's nighttime and they will probably pour into the island to roost. So that was my theory, anyways. Did a lot of scouting, a lot of preparation, some practice runs, and that is exactly what happened during the eclipse. When the sun obscured the moon, all of a sudden, all these frigate birds started streaming into the island, and being on the boat allowed me to kind of line them up and get underneath them as they were flying in, and I was able to capture this photo here, which was kind of the culmination of a whole lot of planning, and it was my dream photo for many years. So I really hope you've enjoyed seeing my kind of take on wildlife photography today. I will mention, as was mentioned earlier, I do a whole lot of tours and workshops. So some of these are much more photography oriented. Some of them are more general nature expeditions. For example, the Great Bear Rainforest trips and the Haines Triangle birding tours. If I have photography in the name, there's probably a chance that it's more photography oriented. And if it's just a birding tour or an expedition, it might be less so. But yeah, so I do trips for bald eagles, fishing in Vancouver Island, voyages through the Great Bear Rainforest for bears and whales, trips up in the mountains of the Yukon to see all the birds and wildlife there, trips in places like Ecuador. I've some new trips launching, like this trip to Mexico to photograph and observe the seabirds and macaws. I do trips in Alberta every year, and I also am launching an official Yukon winter tour next winter. So most of these trips all the trips for 2026 and the ones that I've announced so far in January and February 2027 are sold out. The next one I'm going to be announcing is the Yukon winter trip in March 2027. The best way, if you are interested in joining any of the trips that I do, is to send me an email. I'll have my email on the next slide and let me know. Because typically the way these work is when I'm announcing a trip, usually I will let the people know who have told me they want to come. So if you want to come on a trip, tell me, and then I will send you an email when I'm ready to start booking the trip. And often the trips just sell out from people who told me they want to come. If there's still some spots, I'll send it out in my newsletter or put it on social media. But the best way, if you want to join any of these trips, is to send me an email and join what I call the wish list. And then you can let me know which trips you're interested in, and then I'll keep you in the loop. But the little plug aside there, I just want to really say thank you. I hope you enjoyed hearing me talk about my passion. I really love what I get to do. I'm very fortunate to live in this part of the world. And I really love getting to share my photography with people like you. If you're interested in seeing more, all my links are on screen there. You can also use your phone and take a picture of the code, the QR code in the bottom left, and then it'll pull up all these links for you on your screen, and you won't have to like write them down. You'll be able to see them right there. But anyways, with that, I would just like to say thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions, I am also more than happy to answer. So thank you very much.
Wow.